On the calm evening of January 13, 2012, the Costa Concordia glided across the Tyrrhenian Sea like a vision lifted from a dream. With more than 4,200 souls aboard, tourists, crew, musicians, chefs, newlyweds, families, and waiters who had done this journey 100 times, she shimmered in the moonlight, 37 meters high and 13 decks tall, a steel leviathan with soft carpeting and buffet lines. This was not just a ship, it was a palace, a floating resort town with a spa, casino, theater, and open decks that looked out on a calm, forgiving ocean. But the sea, as it often does, was watching silently, and it remembers everything. Launched in 2005, the Costa Concordia was one of Italy's proudest cruise liners, a 290-meter marvel of engineering and tourism. Her name meant harmony, a nod to the unity of nations and cultures she was designed to carry across the Mediterranean. With a crew trained in international hospitality and safety protocols, and with all the modern instruments of navigation at her command, she seemed unsinkable. Everyone always says that, don't they? That night, as she left the port of Civitavecchia and headed northwest along the Italian coast, most passengers had just finished dinner. Some lounged in the ship's lounges, others explored the atrium or leaned on the railing to take in the stars. A few noticed how close the ship had come to the rocky coast of Isola del Giglio, a picturesque island known more for its sleepy harbor than for shipwrecks. But nobody said anything. After all, this sail past was tradition, a bit of flair. The captain had done it before. On the bridge stood Francesco Schettino, a man whose confidence had earned him admiration and, among some, quiet concern. He was known to be charming, dramatic, and, on occasion, a little too theatrical with his ship maneuvers. That night, he decided to bring the Costa Concordia in close to Giglio to perform a salute, a sort of maritime bow to the island. He claimed it was to honor a retired crew member's hometown. Others suspected it was for his own ego. Whatever the reason, it meant taking the ship off its programmed course, closer to land, into shallower waters. He ordered the turn. The sea complied. The crew, some surprised, executed the command. At 9:45 p.m., the ship tilted gently as it maneuvered closer to the island's dark silhouette. Passengers felt the slight roll and thought little of it. A few stepped outside to photograph the island lights. Children pointed to the buildings on shore. Somewhere in the engine room, the ship hummed as it adjusted to the captain's whim. And then, beneath the surface, a rock formation waited, unmapped and unseen, older than anything man had built. At 9:45:07 p.m., the ship's starboard side scraped the reef. The sound was low, grating, and deep, metal against stone, slow and final. Beneath deck 4, a 53-meter gash tore through the hull. Water rushed in, generators failed. The ship lost power almost instantly. Emergency lighting kicked in, elevators froze. Kitchens went dark. And the illusion, the spa music, the clinking of glasses, the buffet lines, the stage shows, all of it unraveled into confusion. But for a few minutes, most passengers didn't realize. The lights flickered, the ship slowed. A murmur of concern passed through the crowd. Crew members tried to calm guests. Just an electrical issue, some said. We'll be back underway shortly. But down below, seawater was flooding the engine rooms. The ship was mortally wounded, though her vast body hadn't yet accepted the truth. Schettino realized it quickly. He had been on the bridge, watching the coastline too closely. Now he saw his instruments flash warnings, and his crew scrambled to verify the extent of the damage. He didn't speak at first. Then, over internal comms, he tried to minimize. Delay the alarm. Don't tell the passengers yet. Try to steer her closer to shore, but nothing was responding. The rudder was failing. The propulsion was gone. The ship drifted. By 10:05 p.m., the Costa Concordia began to tilt noticeably to port. Glasses slid from tables. Passengers gripped handrails. Panic began to seep in. In the bridge, some officers urged the captain to issue the general emergency signal. He hesitated. At 10:10 p.m., 25 minutes after impact, the alarm finally sounded. Too late. What had begun as a showy maneuver had turned into the worst cruise disaster in modern European history. A ship built for joy, for luxury, for laughter and leisure, was now a crippled giant drifting into chaos, powered by human ego and followed by 1,000 silent stars above. This was only the beginning. The crack was not deafening. It didn't explode like cannon fire or rattle the sky with thunder. It was low, grinding, and relentless. A brutal exhale as ancient stone met modern steel. Those who felt it first were in the lower decks, cabin stewards, engine technicians, staff resting between shifts. They heard a sound no cruise ship should make, a dragging groan from the underbelly, like a beast waking from slumber. Above on the bridge, panic didn't come instantly. Confusion did. Instruments blinked. Alarms lit up like fireworks. Water ingress, power loss, propulsion failure. The crew began to scramble. But for crucial minutes, no clear orders were issued. Captain Schettino, caught between disbelief and pride, hesitated. He knew they had hit something, but how badly? Maybe they could save it. Maybe they could steer towards shallower water. Maybe. In those early moments, denial became deadly. Below the waterline, a 53-meter gash had opened across the starboard hull. 5 compartments flooded almost immediately. Water surged into the engine rooms, killing power to the generators. The entire electrical system failed. In one heartbeat, a gleaming $570 million vessel became a dead weight drifting toward the rocks. Passengers felt it as a lurch, then a tilt. Drinks spilled. Lights flickered, then snapped into emergency mode, red and yellow glows replacing chandeliers. Elevators stopped mid-floor. Performers in the ship's theater stood frozen in their costumes. In the dining rooms, waiters tried to smile as plates clattered to the floor. The announcement came late. Too late. A minor technical issue, a voice said. Everything is under control. But it wasn't, not by a long shot. At 10:05 p.m., 20 minutes after impact, the ship began to list more dramatically. Windows on the port side slipped beneath the water. On the starboard side, staircases turned treacherous. Families gripped railings. Children cried. Crew members began passing life jackets, but there was no coordinated plan. Chaos multiplied. Elevation became everything. Those on lower decks faced flooding and darkness, while those higher up tried to piece together what was happening. Still, the captain hadn't given the order to abandon ship. He was trying to navigate closer to shore, relying on the ship's residual inertia to drift towards shallows off Giglio Island. It was a risky move, but perhaps the only hope left. Without power, without thrusters, without control, the massive vessel turned slowly, like a wounded animal seeking the sand. And somehow, it made it. At 10:44 p.m., the Costa Concordia grounded itself in shallow waters near the island. For a fleeting moment, there was hope. She might remain afloat long enough to evacuate, but hope was short-lived. The tilt continued. Internal flooding spread unchecked. The ship began rotating onto her side. Everything inside moved sideways. Beds, tables, televisions, food trays, all slid or slammed against the inner walls. One restaurant's entire buffet station toppled and scattered down a hallway. Passengers were climbing, not walking. Crew shouted conflicting directions. Some lifeboats deployed, others jammed, stuck high above the waterline as the ship tipped further and further. By now, passengers had taken matters into their own hands. Some leapt into the water, others climbed along railings, using towels and bed sheets as makeshift ropes. A few brave crew members ignored protocol and helped families find paths to the decks. In the pitch-black stairwells, flashlights flickered and failed. Screams echoed. One woman slipped in the dark and broke her leg. Another lost sight of her children in the surge of bodies. On the island of Giglio, residents saw the impossible. A cruise liner, lit by emergency strobes, keeling over just off their coast. They rushed to their boats. Fishermen, retirees, teenagers, they all took to the water, ferrying the stranded to shore. Locals opened their homes, their shops, their chapels. Coffee and blankets were passed around. It was the townspeople, not the cruise line, who were first to respond. And where was the captain? Still on the bridge. For now, the ship continued to tilt. By midnight, she was nearly on her side. Her starboard flank pressed against the reef. Her name still gleamed in the moonlight, proud and false. The moment of impact had lasted seconds. Its consequences would stretch into years. Trials, accusations, heartbreak, and a salvage effort unlike any the world had ever seen. But for those trapped aboard that night, time moved differently. Every minute without direction, without light, without rescue, was a minute too long. And yet the worst betrayal was still to come. There's a kind of panic that doesn't sound like screaming. It sounds like silence, like the heavy breath of someone realizing that no one is in control. On the Costa Concordia, as the ship continued to tilt further into the cold January night, that silence wrapped around everyone. It clung to the stairwells, it flooded the lounges, and then it shattered, as desperation replaced confusion. By 11 o'clock p.m., over an hour since the impact, the ship lay heavily on her starboard side, wedged into the shallow rocks of Giglio Island, but not stable. She kept leaning. Decks meant to be walked on were now walls. Hallways turned into ramps. Tables and chairs became obstacles or lifelines, depending on how you landed. The crew, most of whom had never trained for anything like this, tried to maintain order. But the ship's internal systems were down. There was no central command, no functioning intercom. Many crew members spoke little or no Italian, and passengers no English. Communication broke down fast. The evacuation was chaotic. Lifeboats on the port side, now high above the water, were nearly impossible to lower due to the ship's angle. Some crew members tried to deploy them anyway, using ropes and improvisation. Others gave up. People crowded staircases, slipping, colliding. One man carried his elderly mother on his back for 5 decks, while a young waiter formed a human chain to lead 20 people through a flooded corridor using only a pocket flashlight. Heroism wasn't planned, it was spontaneous and personal. Many lifeboats launched far too late. Passengers described waiting an hour in their life jackets before someone even told them where to go. By the time they reached the lifeboats, the list was so extreme that the boats hung uselessly above water or slammed awkwardly into the hull during deployment. Some passengers jumped into the sea. Others clung to railings, waiting for orders that never came. Inside the ship, the darkness deepened. With every shift of the hull, unsecured furniture crashed against the walls. Elevators were useless. Narrow hallways became traps. Families were separated. One woman, searching for her husband, wandered for over an hour through knee-deep water in tilted cabins. She passed a bar where cocktail glasses still sat half full, untouched since before the impact. On deck, flares were finally launched. The townspeople of Giglio, by now fully mobilized, saw them from shore. Some took out fishing boats. Others launched dinghies. The island's modest emergency services were overwhelmed, but they rose to the moment. The church opened its doors. Locals brought towels and coffee. Teenagers offered phone chargers. The humanity of strangers stood in sharp contrast to the paralysis aboard the ship. At 11:19 p.m., the order to abandon ship was finally given, more than an hour after the collision. It was among the last official acts of command. After that, the ship descended into something else entirely. Survival. And what about the crew? Some were brave, others panicked, and some vanished, retreating to the dark edges of the ship or blending into the passengers. In the dining rooms, cooks handed out bread and water before fleeing. A classical quartet played a final song in the main hall before disbanding. Some musicians were later seen guiding people by hand through flooded stairwells, their uniforms soaked, their instruments lost. Children cried not from pain, but from confusion. Parents whispered reassurances they didn't believe. Lifeboats overloaded. The crew yelled for balance, but balance was gone. In the ship and in the minds of those trying to escape her. Over 30 people would die that night. Some drowned, some were crushed, some were simply never found. Others were pulled from the water hours later, hypothermic and wide-eyed. A handful of passengers were stranded until morning, trapped in air pockets or lifeboats that never deployed. One couple climbed through a broken window, using bed sheets to rappel down the hull into a rescue boat. By the early hours of January 14th, rescue helicopters circled above. The ship lay on her side like a toppled skyscraper. Her name, once illuminated in soft white lights, now reflected only the red beams of emergency responders. And amid all this, one figure had quietly slipped away, someone whose duty had been to stay to the end. The captain was gone. As dawn approached and the full shape of the disaster became clear, those who survived would ask the same question. How could a ship this large, this modern, be so unprepared? And where were the leaders they trusted? In the coming days, the world would get answers, but they would not come gently. He was supposed to be the last man aboard. That's the code. It's not written in maritime law, but it's etched in culture, in expectations, in the quiet agreement between captains and the sea. You go down with your ship, or you make sure no one else does. But on the night of January 13, 2012, Captain Francesco Schettino unbroke that pact. And when he did, he didn't just leave behind a tilting cruise liner. He left behind a nation's faith and a wound in the soul of maritime history. In the hours before disaster, Schettino had been in full command. He had ordered the deviation from the planned route. He had brought the Costa Concordia dangerously close to Giglio Island, reportedly to impress a retired colleague and, perhaps, a female companion on the bridge. Witnesses later testified that he had been casual, even jovial, as the ship skimmed toward land. Then came the collision, and with it, an opportunity to show true leadership. Instead, he hesitated, he delayed the alarm, he delayed the evacuation. And when the ship began to list uncontrollably, he vanished. Some crew members recalled him issuing fragmented orders. Others said he simply left the bridge. In the confusion, no one quite knew who was in charge. Radio calls from the Coast Guard received little useful response. Even as passengers scrambled through hallways and jumped into the water, the captain's voice was notably absent. Then around 11:30 p.m., reports emerged that Schettino was no longer aboard the ship. He had boarded a lifeboat, while hundreds remained trapped inside. It wasn't until an audio recording was released days later that the world fully grasped the betrayal. "Vada a bordo, cazzo!" shouted Gregorio De Falco, the officer from the Italian Coast Guard, in a now legendary call. "Get back on board, damn it!" De Falco, trying to coordinate the rescue from land, had discovered that Schettino had evacuated early. His fury spilled through the radio waves. "There are people still on board. What are you doing? Go up the bow, go up and coordinate the evacuation." But the captain was evasive, mumbling excuses. He never returned to the ship. The phrase "Vada a bordo, cazzo" became an instant symbol of honor confronting cowardice, of duty demanding accountability. It appeared on T-shirts, headlines, and protest signs. To the public, Schettino wasn't just a negligent captain, he was a national disgrace. In the weeks that followed, as divers searched for bodies and engineers examined the wreck, Schettino gave interviews. He insisted he had slipped and fallen into a lifeboat. He claimed he had help from shore. He said he had been a victim of fate, but his explanations unraveled fast. Witnesses contradicted him. Crew members testified that he had downplayed the emergency. Data logs showed a course dangerously close to the rocks, with no clear justification. It became clear, the disaster wasn't just about error, it was about ego. In 2015, Schettino was convicted of multiple charges, including manslaughter, causing a maritime disaster, and abandoning ship. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The courtroom was packed, survivors wept, and even as the verdict was read, Schettino maintained that he had been unfairly vilified. But outside that courtroom, the judgment had long been rendered. He had become a global pariah, a symbol of what happens when vanity outweighs responsibility. While some praised the individual crew members who acted heroically, guiding passengers, risking their own lives, Schettino became the counterpoint, a captain who saved himself. And yet, his story is not just about personal failure. It reveals something deeper about the systems we trust. The ship was enormous. The company was profitable. Safety briefings were routine. But when the worst happened, all that structure collapsed in a matter of minutes. One man's poor judgment exposed a cascading vulnerability, a dependence on hierarchy, a lack of preparation, a misplaced trust in procedures that weren't followed. In maritime history, captains are remembered for how they end their journeys. Edward Smith of the Titanic went down with his ship. Ernest Shackleton, when stranded in Antarctica, saved every single man under his command. Francesco Schettino, by contrast, left under cover of night, his passengers still scrambling for lifeboats. And while the Costa Concordia remained there for years, tilted like a wound in the sea, Schettino sat on land, a free man for a time, his name spoken in disgust. In the end, the question was not just about him, it was about all of us, about what kind of leadership we expect, about how we prepare for disaster, and about who we become when the lights go out and the floor tilts beneath our feet. Because the sea remembers, and now so does the world. When the sun rose over the Tyrrhenian Sea on January 14, 2012, the Costa Concordia lay on her side, half submerged, half exposed, like a fallen monument to human overconfidence. Her towering decks, once filled with laughter and music, now faced sideways into the air. Curtains fluttered from broken windows. Bright orange lifeboats floated adrift or hung awkwardly along the hull. And on the rocks of Isola del Giglio, the people who had rescued the ship's passengers stared out at the wreck, realizing she wasn't going anywhere. The ship hadn't sunk completely. Instead, she had settled onto a shallow reef, her starboard flank buried into the sea floor, preventing a full descent. But the damage was immense and highly visible. For the next 2.5 years, the Costa Concordia would remain stranded, a 114,000-ton reminder of everything that had gone wrong. To the residents of Giglio, it was surreal. Their tranquil island, population just over 1,000, had become the focus of international attention. Journalists camped out in the harbor. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Tourists arrived not to see the island's historic churches or clear waters, but to glimpse the wrecked colossus that loomed over the bay. Locals began calling it La Nave, the ship, as if it needed no name. Everyone knew which one. But as the weeks passed and the bodies were recovered, 32 in total, including a 5-year-old girl and several crew members, focus shifted from grief to the logistical nightmare of what came next. How do you remove a ship the size of a skyscraper from the edge of a cliff? Initially, there were suggestions to cut the ship apart underwater and remove it piece by piece. But this was rejected. The area was environmentally fragile. The fuel on board, nearly 2,300 tons, posed a massive ecological risk. Salvaging her would be the largest, most complex maritime recovery ever attempted. Enter a team of international engineers, marine salvers, and underwater construction specialists. The plan they proposed was unprecedented. Rather than dismantle the ship, they would rotate it upright in one piece, a process called parbuckling, then refloat her, tow her away, and scrap her on land. But first, the sea had to cooperate. For over a year, divers and engineers worked around the clock. The ship was stabilized with underwater platforms and steel cables. Enormous sponsons, giant flotation tanks, were welded to the hull. Every operation had to account for wind, haze, and the ever-present risk of collapse. All of it took place beneath the watchful eyes of the media and a public still hungry for answers. Meanwhile, the ship herself continued to shift. Internal walls collapsed. Mold overtook the cabins. Fish swam through the theater and casinos. The seawater, initially cold and preserving, began to break down the wiring, the walls, the once pristine surfaces. Yet she remained, silent, looming, defiant. She became something more than wreckage. The Costa Concordia turned into a symbol of failure, yes, but also of memory. For survivors, she was a wound. For Giglio, an unwanted guest. For engineers, a challenge. For the rest of the world, a kind of floating monument to modern hubris. On September 17, 2013, after 19 hours of delicate adjustment, the ship was finally rotated upright. Slowly, inch by inch, the sponsons filled with water, acting like levers. Cables pulled, hydraulics groaned, and cameras captured every painful movement. When the operation finished, applause erupted, not just on the docks, but around the world. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the Costa Concordia stood straight, still battered, still broken, but vertical. It was a triumph of engineering and perseverance. But she wasn't done yet. It would take another year to make her buoyant. More sponsons were attached. The ship was pumped out and sealed. In July 2014, the final act began. Tugs pulled her from Giglio's Bay, moving at a speed of 2 knots. The slowest, most watched voyage in cruise ship history. She was escorted like a fallen queen. Divers followed, helicopters circled. People stood on the shores of Italy to watch her pass one last time. Her destination, Genoa, where she would be dismantled piece by piece. The Costa Concordia had not gone down easily. She had not slipped into the deep and disappeared. She had lingered, She had made sure the world saw her broken, her story unfinished. And perhaps that's why she haunts us, because she stayed. And because sometimes what refuses to sink becomes the hardest to forget. There is something profoundly humbling about watching the sea give something back, especially something it never wanted to return. For over 2 years, the Costa Concordia had lain like a massive wound at the edge of Giglio Island. Locals grew used to her shape on the horizon. Survivors tried to forget her. Engineers planned her resurrection. And then, in a feat that bordered on impossible, the ocean loosened its grip. The operation to raise the ship was known as the Parbuckling Project, a term as unwieldy as the task itself. This was not just another salvage. This was a Leviathan-scale recovery, led by a multinational consortium and overseen by Italian authorities, with eyes from every corner of the maritime world watching. The cost? Over $1.2 billion. The goal? To right a ship that was never supposed to be horizontal. The process began with securing the wreck. Divers installed 26 massive platforms on the seafloor, driving pilings deep into the bedrock to create a steel foundation. Next came sponsons, huge steel tanks, some over 30 meters tall, welded to the ship's port side. These would act as both counterweights and flotation devices. It was a delicate, dangerous ballet of pressure and balance. Inside the ship, conditions were nightmarish. The interiors had collapsed. Mold grew unchecked. Personal belongings floated in stagnant water. Human remains, long lost, were sometimes discovered in hidden corners. Every movement stirred memories. Then, in September 2013, the world held its breath. Over 500 engineers, divers, welders, and technicians coordinated the lift. It took 19 hours, running through the night. Inch by inch, the ship rolled upright, groaning and shuddering like a creature waking from a deep, toxic sleep. Cameras streamed it live. Journalists whispered like they were at a funeral. And when it was done, when the Costa Concordia stood once more, there was applause, yes, but also silence. Because now, for the first time, people could see the full extent of her wounds. The starboard side, buried for over 2 years, was crushed and corroded. Paint had peeled, metal had buckled. Barnacles and seaweed clung to her skin. Windows were shattered, railings warped. But she stood, bruised, disgraced, but still standing. The next phase was to make her float again. More sponsons were attached to the starboard side. The entire hull was pumped out, air replacing seawater. Slowly, the ship began to rise. Divers checked every joint, every weld. Tension was everywhere. The structure could break. The cables could snap. The ocean could pull her back. But it didn't. In July 2014, after months of preparation, the Costa Concordia was finally towed away from Giglio. Her departure was met with mixed emotions. For the islanders, it was a relief, the end of a long, unwanted vigil. For survivors and families of the victims, it was closure, but also a reminder. The ship moved slowly, escorted by tugboats, accompanied by helicopters and news crews. She passed the Italian coastline like a ghost ship in daylight. Her name still visible, but her purpose long lost. The destination was Genoa, a city known more for shipbuilding than for shipbreaking. There, over the next 3 years, she was dismantled piece by piece. Her steel was recycled, her interiors gutted. Nothing was saved for display, no grand memorial, no final berth in a maritime museum. The wreck was not honored, it was processed. And perhaps that was appropriate. The Costa Concordia was not a tale of heroic adventure or noble tragedy. It was a modern failure, born of arrogance, sealed by delay, and only redeemed by the tireless work of those who refused to look away. Even in destruction, she remained monumental. Over 60,000 tons of material were removed. Environmental hazards were neutralized. The salvage team was praised for achieving the impossible. And though the ship would never sail again, her story had become a textbook in crisis, recovery, and responsibility. Today, the sight off Giglio is once again clear. The reef has recovered. The ocean looks calm, but somewhere beneath that surface, the shape of the Costa Concordia still lingers. In the minds of those who saw her rise, and in the silence that followed her fall, Because raising the giant wasn't just about steel and ballast. It was about making sure the sea didn't get the last word. The Costa Concordia began her life as a promise, a floating paradise, a marvel of design and engineering meant to carry thousands across Europe's most picturesque coastlines in luxury. She ended her life as a dismantled husk, her pieces scattered across Genoa's shipyards, her name etched into maritime infamy. But between those two identities, between champagne launches and rusted hull, lay a story that changed how the world views ships, safety, and the fragile line between confidence and catastrophe. In the aftermath of the disaster and her final dismantling, a quiet reckoning began. Cruise lines around the world re-examined their safety protocols. Emergency drills became mandatory before departure. Lifeboat access was reassessed. Bridge hierarchies were revisited, and black box systems became more sophisticated. For all her flaws, the Costa Concordia left behind a legacy of reform, one born of pain, but necessary. The ship itself? She left nothing behind, no grand exhibit, no gleaming artifact on display. Unlike the Vasa, preserved and revered, the Costa Concordia was reduced to scrap metal. Her remains were sold off, recycled, and anonymized. A few pieces, letters from her nameplate, photographs, or tiny bits of interior trim survive in private collections or courtrooms as evidence. But nothing remains for the public to stand before and remember. And perhaps that's fitting. The Costa Concordia was not a symbol of exploration or daring. She didn't sink because of nature's rage or enemy fire. She fell victim to hubris, to a culture that celebrated image over preparation. Her story doesn't inspire with glory, it warns with consequences. For the families of the 32 victims, the story remains open. Lawsuits continue. Memories linger. The empty seats at dinner, the holidays that feel too quiet, the birthdays never celebrated again. These are the echoes that never truly fade. And yet, there are glimmers of something else too. There were passengers who carried strangers through flooded quarters, crew members who ignored protocol to do the right thing, islanders who opened their homes in the dead of night, bringing soup, socks, and phone chargers to dripping survivors, helicopter pilots who flew missions back and forth until their fuel tanks ran dry, divers who braved collapsing hallways to search for the missing long after the headlines had moved on. These are the other legacies, the ones not made of steel, but of action. The Costa Concordia reminded the world that technology is not enough, that ships, no matter how modern, still need leaders, that drills matter, that time matters, that hesitation costs lives. In the end, the ship became a cautionary tale, not just for the cruise industry, but for any system that relies on humans making the right decisions at the right moment. For Jaleo, the island returned to peace. The harbor was cleared. The water sparkled again. The tourists slowly returned, not to photograph a wreck, but to enjoy the beauty that had been overshadowed for too long. And yet, even today, locals sometimes look out at the horizon and remember the night when everything tilted. The Costa Concordia is gone, her decks are dismantled, her name is stained, but her story is not finished. Not because of her steel, but because of her lesson. In the long memory of maritime history, she stands not as a triumph, but as a warning. That even giants can fall sideways, that the ocean respects no titles, and that the difference between pride and wreckage is often measured in minutes. There's something haunting about a shipwreck you remember from your own lifetime. The Costa Concordia was not a legend buried in time. It was a modern disaster, complete with smartphones, news choppers, and courtroom drama. And yet, even with all our technology, it felt like something ancient, a cautionary tale written not in myth but in steel and seawater. She was supposed to be unforgettable for her luxury. Instead, she's remembered for her silence, her tilt, her ghostly presence off a sleepy Italian island. But from that wreck came more than headlines. It brought clarity to how we prepare, how we lead, and what we expect when the world tilts unexpectedly beneath our feet. In the vast narrative of maritime history, the Costa Concordia now holds a strange place. Not a relic, not a hero, but a shadow. And sometimes the shadows are where the most powerful lessons live. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story moved you, I hope you'll stay aboard for the next one. The sea holds many more secrets, and we're just beginning to listen.